Greetings and good day, wherever you happen to be joining us from. I'm so glad that you're here. Whatever platform you're on, wherever you're located, I'm just glad you're here. And if you follow these lives regularly, you know this isn't our normal time, a slightly different time of day and a different day of the week, but we're glad to be here anyway. So the first thing I want to say is if you are here on a social channel with us live right now, I hope you'll hit your comment area and say hello. Tell us where you're from. I'd love to know that. And just a couple things before we set up this for the podcast itself. So if you don't know, this will eventually be created as a episode number 341 of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. But give us a second to be here live before we get ready to start that recording separately. So you don't have to do anything different except to hang out and sit back and enjoy. And while you're here, I hope that you'll imagine that you're joining us for a cup of coffee or your favorite beverage, depending on what time of day it is for you, and just share your questions and comments and ideas with my guest and I as we have our conversation, because your input will make for a better conversation and eventually a better podcast episode too. So if you like what you see here, there's one other thing going on tomorrow afternoon in a webinar that I'm doing, a second version of it. I did one today, 5 mistakes that leaders make. You can join us at kevineichenberry.com/mistake webinar. And there you can learn all about what that is and how you can get registered for that for free. I hope you'll do that. But mostly right now, what I hope you'll do is to sit back and enjoy and participate in what is about to become a future episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. So I'm going to count down and then we'll officially start that. Okay. So Marissa, we're going to start in 3, 2, 1. In the big picture, leadership development is big business. On a personal level, it's too important to ignore for us as leaders. People continue to look for ways to encourage that development, find ways to make it more interesting and lasting. A leader herself, our guest today, is a proponent for developing leaders in a unique way. You're here because you want to be a better leader, make a bigger impact, be a more remarkable leader. And today you're going to learn a new way, a new path to help you get there. Welcome to another live episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. If you are listening to this podcast, you could be live for future episodes on your favorite social media channel. You can get access to that information and join us for future live episodes, and therefore interact with my guests and I, and get this information sooner by joining our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to do that. Today's episode is brought to you by Remarkable Masterclasses. Remarkable Masterclasses are a way to help you become the remarkable leader and human you were born to be. Details on how to get on board for a specific skill and learn more can all be found at remarkablemasterclass.com. And so with that, what I want to do is bring in my guest, add her to the stream there. If you're watching, you can see her. Let me introduce our guest to you today. Our guest today is Melanie Bell. She is the co-founder of Strategic Peace, a company that helps businesses create and generate outstanding revenue growth by bringing together their marketing, sales, and service teams around an information-driven customer experience based on the HubSpot platform. She is an active angel investor and mentors the students in student accelerator programs at Rice University's OwlSpark and the University of Houston's RED Labs. Before founding Strategic Peace, she was the president of Marketing Interface. She has another venture, and we'll talk about that shortly. But for right now, Melanie, welcome. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, okay, I'm going to tell everybody what Melanie told me before we started, and that is this is her first podcast. So, Melanie, I'm so glad that you're here, and I'm glad that maybe this will be the first of many, many, many for you. So
that would be awesome.
So I want to start the way I often start, and that is to give people a little bit more a sense about you beyond a bio. So tell us about your journey. What sort of leads you to doing the work that you do every day? Tell us a little bit about your journey.
Sure. So I'm definitely one of those people who I think, and probably hopefully makes for a more interesting story, in that it wasn't like, oh, I wanted to be a doctor, and so I went to med school. Okay, I became a doctor. It's been a bit more windy. Um, I, when I was graduating from college, needed to figure out a job. I was living in Canada and not Canadian, and needed it to be related to what I had studied in school. And so I made up a case for how marketing was related to studying liberal arts. And so I ended up working in digital marketing. That was my start, and it was because I needed a visa. It's been a great fit. I After doing that for a couple of years, and actually after 1 year, I became the manager of my company's department. We were growing really, really fast. It was exciting, but I felt like I needed more of a solid business background. So I decided to go back to business school, and loved the startup space, loved tech space. So I joined a startup accelerator when I graduated there. And then after a couple of years of running their marketing, decided I wanted to go out on my own. So I started my own company almost 8 years ago. My first client was a venture capital group. I've worked with lots of everyone from founders who are really getting started and figuring out what their business is going to do at all, to companies that have 200 people and figuring out how they're going to grow. So it's been interesting. But the other kind of dual side of this, because I'm not really here to talk about marketing, as fun and insightful as that is that I've been a really avid reader. That got shelved as the more and more I kind of went up the ladder or went to business school. That really fell by the wayside. And it's come back to me in the last few years, and it's just been such an impactful leadership thing. So I know we'll kind of get into that, but that's kind of my new stage in the story. But that's at chapter 1.
Yeah, we'll get to chapter 2 here in just a second.
Yeah.
But I opened the show before I introduced you by talking about leadership development, and everyone's trying to figure out ways to do that. And obviously you're in the marketing world, but you also are a business owner and you have a team. So what is it that draws you to leadership development, or why does it matter to you?
Sure. I think so. My first experience where I was really getting into a leadership role, I was becoming a manager of this department, and I hadn't really had a manager. Like, I had a couple of people higher than me, but it was like I was stepping into this role I hadn't really seen anybody do. And I felt quite lost. It wasn't a positive experience. I definitely I think if you talk to people who were on my team at the time, they probably don't have great memories of me, unfortunately. But I had no clue what I was doing. And so it was definitely kind of learning as I went and figuring out and making mistakes. That was one of the things that appealed to me about business school, was there was a way to go study this without having to just constantly be in the line of fire. And so I think it was just like, I knew that there was, at the time I went to my boss, I'm like, okay, so can you explain to me, like, how do I go learn how to be a leader or go be a manager? And their answer was, go read psychology books. And that was about the most training we got. I think we had like 2 half-day seminars in a year and a half on how to do this. And so I was completely lost.
See, now they could have just said, go listen to the Remarkable Leadership podcast, right? But that didn't probably exist.
Yes, podcasts were not a thing.
Here's the thing. That story, I mean, the end part of that story, I got promoted from being a member of the team to being in charge of the team, going what we call from bud to boss, is a hard thing. It's like the hardest thing for any of us to do in our career. And I know a lot of people that are watching and listening have been there and done that. But you gave us a clue that you didn't say it, but I think you told us that your undergrad degree is not in marketing, is not in business, but is in liberal arts.
Yes. So my major was international development studies. So it was a lot of political science, economics, anthropology, geography, that
and
total.
a lot of reading. So the teasing is done. We're not going to tease this any longer. I want you to tell us what this other brand new venture is.
Yes. So I've started a group, and it is really, right now, it is a group. It's early days. It's called Leaders Who Fiction. And this was a bit of a brainchild for me of kind of came from, I had an aha moment, and this was like probably almost 10 years ago. After business school, I was working in a startup accelerator, and my friend had recommended this science fiction book to me. And I'm not a big science fiction reader. That's kind of outside my comfort zone. And it was written for kids. And I remember like reading it, and I was like, oh my God, I really wish I had read this in business school. Like, this was better than the management books that they had us read through business school. And so I had kind of gradually increased how much I was reading. I have a lot of friends and clients who I would talk to about reading who are avid readers, and they're like, I can't find the time to do this. And so this was my idea that I had it was actually a year ago, of, well, what if we were, had the benefit of a group of people. So we, as leaders, we all need to build our networks and that kind of thing, which especially is for people who are, I'm an ambivert, but introverts or ambiverts, that's not the most comfortable thing for us to go do. But it helps when you have something concrete to talk around. But let's create a group that gives people this excuse to pick up their fiction, because everyone, like a lot of people I know, they are reading business books. Okay, I've got this challenge at work, I'm going to go read that. But the last time they read a novel, years ago, even if that's something that they really enjoyed. And so I felt like this was, if kind of a way to say, hey, look, like, I still want you to read for enjoyment, but I'm going to give you a productive excuse for doing that. So that was how this idea came about. So we meet normally about once a month, like a book club. I mean, hopefully it will kind of not just stop at a book club, but that's where we're at right now. And
Well, we'll get to some of that in a minute. I want to talk about the whole book club thing and all that in a second, but
sure.
I want to, you've sort of given us the genesis of this. But why, from your perspective, is fiction so powerful for us when we think about it as a leader?
Sure. So I had just noticed it anecdotally for myself. The more I read, the more I was able to take a leadership role with my clients. I was able to communicate better. I felt like I had a different level of understanding for them. And then I wondered, I was like, okay, so am I a one-off here? Like, is this just working for me, because I'm a reader or something like that? And so I've spent quite a bit of time doing a lot of research. There are a handful of articles that people have written that talk about the connection between fiction and leadership, but it's not a lot. I mean, you can look at, there's a couple articles in HBR, Forbes, Inc., those go to. But what I found really interesting is there's a lot of research that's been done on the connection between reading fiction and, from a neuroscience perspective, what's the psychological benefit that we get? What parts of the brain are triggered when we read fiction? How is that, first of all, how is reading different than watching TV or listening to a podcast or video, but also specifically the fiction aspect of it versus nonfiction? And there's a lot of actual science that backs this up. And so there's stuff it does increase our empathy because we can walk around in somebody else's shoes. Some of the other interesting points that I've read have been about how, if you're reading a business book, a lot of time the writers have distilled problems down into their core essence. And so we get a very black and white, sometimes black, gray, and white view of problems. Whereas with fiction, authors are really trying to make characters complicated. They're trying to make situations much more real. And so it trains our brain to not jump to conclusions as fast. And it allows us to look through issues that are really complex and be able to navigate that. And I mean, talk about what we're talking, what we say leaders in the 21st century, what skills they need, the creativity, the complex problem solving, that kind of stuff is just so powerful. And I'm like, okay, there's been research on the neuroscience aspect of that.
Okay, so all that's cool, like, and interesting, right? And for nonfiction readers, now they're going to go dive into all that, which is fine. It's great. But at a practical level, how do we, you and your group, you yourself, what's your advice to us about translating that? Like, okay, I'm reading this story, right?
Yeah.
How do I translate that? I have some thoughts that I want to share, but I really want to know what
Sure.
your advice is about how to translate that back to leadership in general, or perhaps the specific challenge that you're facing right now.
Sure. So to me, I mean, obviously there's like the benefit of communication skills, but you have to be reading quality fiction too for that. Like you can't, it can't just be some crap book.
Oh,
But
okay. Well, we'll get to all that in a few minutes.
yeah.
Okay, tip
but
number one, everybody, don't read, quote, crap books. That's
crap
Melanie's
books.
first tip for you.
I think, and this goes back to, I think when my first bosses and I was stepping into this managerial role and I was at a loss, they said, go read psychology books, because if you understand people, then you're going to be a better leader. You're going to be able to better manage them. And so much and this is different, I think, too, than high school English class when you like, okay, I'm like learning to write, read for symbolism and allegories and all that kind of stuff. When I read now, what I'm looking at is, what are the power dynamics in a scene? Who has the power? What are the stakes? And really, what's that character's underlying motivation? And I think it's an interesting brain exercise for leaders to be able to start picking that up. And so that you can read. I mean, we're leading people, we're leading communities and teams and individuals. And so it's almost like that practical exercise that you can have without having to do it in real life and maybe get it wrong. So I think, to me, that's like one of the biggest things is learning how to read people.
The stakes are lower. We're doing it in the third person, if you will, right? And we're able to do it. We're able to do it slowly. Like we can stop reading, we can stop and we can ponder. I like to think about this, and not just with fiction, but all sorts of things. So like observing, or in this case, reading through a leadership lens. I mean, what you start out by saying is, I'm looking at the power dynamics and looking at the relationships. You can certainly be looking at the communication skills or approaches, right? So asking yourself ahead of time, what would I do? Why did that work, or why did that not work? All that stuff, looking at it through the lens of leadership. And so you're thinking about doing that with fiction. And we've talked about the neuroscience of reading fiction and all that. What I don't know that maybe anyone who's listening knows is that a long time ago, I worked on a book, which I never finished, the concept of doing the same basic thing with movies. And the project was called Magical Movies. And it was looking at the same idea of how can we take that experience and draw lessons from it, leadership or otherwise. So I'm right in line with you. And quite honestly, that's one of the reasons why I have you here, because I think it's a really useful and interesting thing to think about. How can we work on our leadership skills while we're doing something else? And it's not, as you said earlier, I can have some fun. I can do some reading that I want to do and still get benefit and not have to have a highlighter, right? Necessarily. Right. So
and
I think it's really great. Go ahead.
Yeah. One thing that I thought was interesting, because I think more and more, especially, I mean, talk about the proliferation of social media that's happened in the last few years. And now, I mean, from a marketing perspective, I work a lot of times with the C-suite, and everyone needs to be thought leaders, and brands are going to be storytellers. And a lot of times that's now becoming, when we talk about senior leadership, a lot of their role is that storytelling. And so you can learn that part, I think, through movies, through books, through that kind of story. One interesting thing to me is that when you're reading versus watching a show or listening to something, is that it actually triggers parts in your brain that act as if it's a simulation. And so it's close to, VR or something. I mean, even just reading something on a page, our brains function differently. And so it is that simulation aspect. Plus then, like you said, you have time to think about, well, what, that situation, and do some reflection. But the other amazing thing to me is that because it's somebody else in the story, it's not actually you can also have that reflection and not feel defensive about it. And I think you can get real honest with yourself if you allow yourself to go there. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing that we can take away too.
Well, that's talking about it, Melanie, from that introspective personal experience with that story, with that novel, with that work of fiction,
Yeah,
but you're taking it to a place of giving people a safe place and using that fiction as the jumping off point for conversation. So talk about,
yeah,
we'll call it for now, a group. You said it's kind of a book club, but you hope it's
sure.
more. Like what is
Yeah,
tell us about who has been drawn to join your group and what perhaps you've learned in leading this group.
sure. So we have, it's a real mix of people. We do have some founders that are there. We have people who are working their way up, and I talk corporate ladder. I mean, like Fortune 10 corporate ladder, kind of middle to senior management there. We have a member who is more involved in nonprofits and policy work. We have one of our members is a therapist and business coach, but she works with big hospitals and small companies. And I mean, so she herself is a coach, leadership coach, and she's been involved with it. So it's a real mix of people. And what I've so I like our first meeting was in January. That was we had our first book that we read then. And the interesting thing to me was, and again, like some of the people in our group, they've been very avid readers. I know I know them pretty well, and some of them very well. And I know that they love to read. And what they've told me in the last couple of month or two, and they're like, I've actually already read more this year than I have in the last few years because I've got the deadline, right? I mean, I think from that
I'm not
respect,
going
it
to show up at
functions
the
like
meeting with not having read the book.
it's any group accountability. It gives you the deadline. They're like, oh, I could have started it and just put it down, but I actually finished it because I wanted to show up for this. And I think one of the other things I thought was interesting was one or two people have mentioned they were nervous about coming because they were a bit intimidated, not sure really what they were going to get into. And and then they're like, okay, this wasn't intimidating at all. Because I think as the conversation flows, we do talk about leadership. You can read through the leadership lens, and we talk about that, like kind of what are the big things that we've pulled out from these books on that. But then we have the more fun conversations as well, where, can you believe this character did that? And people do sometimes tie it back to kind of concrete stuff they're dealing with at work, or a specific leadership challenge they're facing. But a lot of times it's more watching the gears turn in their head, while we're having this other conversation. So.
Well, you talked about introvert and extrovert a minute ago, and certainly the more extroverted we are, the more we process verbally, right? And so
Yeah.
just having the chance, whether we're thinking it out loud or having more time yet to think about it introspectively, even if we're in a group, is a useful sort of thing. So you mentioned it earlier, and people are wondering, and so how do you pick your novels? And so I'm going to ask this in two parts, like how do you pick them for your group, but what advice
Sure.
might you have if people want to? We certainly are hoping people are going to say, hey, this is a virtual group, I can join Melanie
Yes.
and her group, leaderswhofiction.com. You can learn a lot more there. But even if I want to do this for myself, well, let's take that in two parts. First, how do you pick your novels for the group?
So it's a combination. At the start, I was picking the books just by myself, of going, either I've read this and I want to reread it, and I think that it has enough meat to have a conversation. Like, I think this would be a good talking around point. There were one or two where I had done my research on them, and I was like, well, I haven't read it, but let's experiment and see how that goes. The interesting thing for me is when I did that, I actually was the one who didn't like the book, but everybody else did. Which was great. I mean, it's fun to not have everyone having the same opinions on this stuff. I do try, and then we do, people, our members have been wanting, and I'm going to call them members for lack of a better word, but people have wanted to also make recommendations of stuff that they think would be good for the group. And so I try to incorporate those into the schedule as well. I do try to be cognizant when we're picking the books. I don't want to pick anything that's too long. We've had two books that were on the longer side, and for those we'd said, well, we'll meet 2 months from now, because I really want to keep this in this is enjoyable, this is doable, this isn't some huge burden, on me. And I think being aware of and being sensitive to people's time is important on that. And I do try to have a mix of genres and, try to keep it balanced between male and female authors and topics, and just try to keep it interesting. But I think one of the cool things when you get a group of people who are choosing books, and ultimately I have the power, I have the veto as the organizer on it, but you read stuff that you wouldn't have picked up otherwise too, which I think is always interesting, to kind of get outside your comfort zone. And so that's how we pick the books for the group.
So I was going to ask you the next question, which I hinted at, which is what advice would you have for us? But everybody just listen to what Melanie just said. That's what you do. Or just go to leaderswhofiction.com and you can see the books that they've done or are going to do. And you can just pick from her list as well. So as you have people thinking about joining you, or if people ask you about this approach, what are the biggest questions that you get from people? Maybe biggest questions, or maybe biggest sort of pushback?
Sure. So I think one pushback that I've had from people is, well, people are so full, like our schedules are so full. Like, how are you expecting people to add another thing to their plate? And, I always hate it when people are like, hey, just keep adding this stuff. Wake up an hour earlier. I'm like, okay, like there's like, we all need rest and we all need downtime, and our families are important, and whatever, our health is important. And so at a certain point, like, I'm not trying to, if you hate reading, I'm not trying to convert you into a reader. I think this is just if this happens to speak to you, if you do like reading fiction, I just don't want those people to feel like they have to give that up. And so if this isn't your thing, totally fine. Like, go listen to podcasts, go do the training courses. I love podcasts. Like, go do it all day if that's what you want to do. And it's, maybe you've got young kids and that's not the right time. It's fine. I do think that there are ways, like the ways that I've started to read more fiction is because I used to not read because my eyes were really tired at the end of the day. Working in especially digital marketing, I was like, I can't look at my eyes just don't want to focus. But if I read for a week or two, my eyes got used to it. My brain got used to it. I started looking forward to it. And so I think there's some just habit shift. One of the other questions that I've had, or pushbacks from people, is if they have to show up every month, like if it's like this big commitment that they're making for a year or something. And it's not like that. We have people who've come to a couple of meetings. We have people that come to every single meeting that we have. So it's really up to each individual. And the other thing is, like, right now, especially because, we're building this and kind of seeing where it's going to go, there's not a cost to this. So you can go check out a book from a library. You can listen to it on an audiobook. I'm so not some people are snobs about these things, e-readers or whatever, like however you read best. And sometimes people even like mixing it up between books. So all of that's good. And
so, Melanie, before we start to round into the final stretch here, is there anything that I didn't ask that you wish I would have?
Trying to think. I think you've covered a lot. No, I think I just want to invite people to come join us. And the best way to find that is to go to our website. We've got the schedule and books and stuff there. And the schedule doesn't work for everybody. That's my other pushback, because right now we have 1 hour available in a month. But if we have more interest, then, maybe we'll have more, because I think it'd be important to keep the groups kind of small.
Leaderswhofiction.com. So other than reading, Melanie, what do you do for fun? We're going to take reading as a given in this particular case.
Yeah, reading is definitely a given. So my other big loves, I like swimming and doing yoga. Those are kind of my other active hobby things. I love to travel. So try to travel several times a year. And although the last 2 years, that's been not as much fun, but I've still traveled a little bit. Um, and then drinking wine. That's my other, if you want to count that as a hobby, drinking wine would be my other.
And listen, depending on how much, you can even drink wine while you're reading your book. There you go.
Exactly.
So,
While traveling, I mean,
or
you can
while
do all of
traveling,
them
or
at the
maybe
same
probably
time.
not while doing yoga or swimming, but the after yoga,
Yeah.
after swimming, right? So,
Yes.
because I know that you did your homework and you told me before we started that you'd listened to several episodes, and those who are listening for more than the first or second time know that I always ask this question. It's never been more appropriate than right now, and that is, what are you reading right now, Melanie?
So right now, I just started a book called "The Story of My Teeth," which is by a Mexican author, but I'm like 6 pages into it. It's hilarious. Um, so I'm excited to read the rest of it, but I don't feel like I'm so far in that I even really have it. I try to not, sometimes I pick books and I don't really look at what they're about until I'm in it and kind of just go along for the ride. And that's one of these books. So that's one book. Um, I, our group this month is reading The Overstory by Richard Powers. I read it last year, and so I'm just kind of going through it that much faster right now. But The Story of My Teeth is the book that I just started.
I can promise all of you that no one on this show has suggested or said that they are reading the story of my teeth, at least not until right now. So, Melanie, we've talked about it several times, but where do you want to point people if they want to learn more about you, your business, this exciting venture? Where do you want to point people?
Sure. So, two places. One would be my LinkedIn profile. So if you look up Melanie Bell, I should come up. My day, like my day job. It's almost weird when you're an entrepreneur to be like, I have my business and a side hustle. It it doesn't resonate as much. But my full business strategic piece. So you can find us on LinkedIn, and the best place. That's probably the best place to connect with me individually. And then check out our website, leaderswhofiction.com.
I'll put it up there again,
Great.
leaderswhofiction.com.
Thank
And now I
you.
have a question for all of you who are listening, perhaps watching, but listening. And that is, now what? What are you going to do as a result of this? Now, usually when I get to this point in the show, I'll list several things that you might want to try or do. In this case, I'm going to say, what fiction book are you going to pick up and start reading and or listening to, right? To Melanie's point. So the question here is, what are you going to do with what you've learned? And in this particular case, that probably means doing some reading, and maybe not what you've read before, or perhaps reading the fiction you already read with that leadership lens. So perhaps you get a new insight or idea that you can apply, whether you do that for yourself, whether you do that with others. Melanie, thank you so much for being here. It was such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate it.
How was your first one?
It was awesome. I hope I didn't ramble too much.
Well, listen, everybody, if you liked this week's episode, you certainly want to make sure you go to leaderswhofiction.com. But if you like this one, you need to come back next week because we'll be here again, doing this again. And if you like this, invite someone to join us, point this out to someone, like this podcast wherever you happen to like it, rate it, or whatever, but let people know, and come back and join us next week for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everybody.